After William by Brian McCabe. My love appeared in the spring of the year of our Lord 1315. It was just after St. Bridget's Day. That is how I remember. That was always my favourite time of the year. The winter was over and it seemed as if life was beginning to stir again after a long sleep. One by one the flowers burst into bloom, splashing their pretty colours and peeping shyly from under their bent heads as I made my way through the great wood. I was never afraid, even though my parents constantly warned me about the danger from wild boar or the pack of wolves which lurked there, and whom I often heard howling at night when I lay awake, looking at the distant moon. Our own animals, the cattle and sheep, which we kept close to the Rath, also began to behave differently at this time of year. And now I understood why, as my mother had explained to me where the blood had come from, and that I was no longer a girl but a woman, and would probably soon have children and a family of my own. I felt strong and joyful, and I sang as I went about my chores that spring. Soon, though, I began to notice that my father was beginning to look worried. Rumours of a great war in the north of the country had begun to circulate in our little settlement. We lived on the edge of the Great Plain, but, as the main road from north to south ran through, we always heard news of what was happening elsewhere. Sometimes my father said that we would be better off not knowing, but I knew that secretly he enjoyed hearing the news from the different parts of the country and the stories of those who had travelled in strange and foreign lands. Soon we heard that the great army of the north was approaching, and then, one day, they marched into our village, headed by a tall young man who was obviously their leader. His hair was long and curly and bright red in the sun. He wore leather warrior's clothes and a shining metal collar about his neck. Over his shoulder was a dark cloak held in place by a golden brooch which was much bigger and shinier than the one which my father, our chieftain, used to wear when he had anything to do before the clan or simply wanted to impress people. The stranger spoke to us in our own language, not like those English who lived in the town or who sometimes passed through on their way to somewhere else. Some of his words, though, were strange and unfamiliar. My father explained that he was from a land across the sea, but that his people were fellow Gaels and that we must make them welcome. He warned, though, that we must not be too friendly, as they would soon pass on their way, and he had heard that they had brought great trouble and even hunger in the lands which they had already marched through. I did not care. I could think only of how much their leader reminded me of one of the heroes of ancient sagas which we heard around our fires at night, and of the tales of the giant Fionn, who had lived on the top of the hill near our village. Every day I managed to find out what the newcomer was doing and made sure to pass where he was bound to see me. His smile when he noticed me brightened those hopeful spring days. Then one day I overheard my father tell my mother that the Scots were leaving in the morning, and how relieved he was that they were moving on, down south, he said. That night I did not sleep. I tossed and turned. I had got used to the visitors and their handsome leader around our village. They had brought excitement to our little world. Things would be so empty when they left again. Gradually I realised what I must do. Later, when all was still, and I was sure that my family were asleep, I made my way quietly to the leader's tent. As the moon rose over the great plain, I gave myself to him, shivering as I did so, for I had heard the priest speak about such things, and I knew that what I was doing would surely damn my immortal soul for eternity. Spring passed into summer. The sun shone and the crops began to grow. It was a dry summer that year, and I remember the heat haze shimmering on the plain as the flocks grazed the grass bare. St. John's Eve was approaching, that time when good luck and fortune was celebrated. Time for feasting and matchmaking. Time to light the bonfires. I well remember the fires that year. They seemed higher and brighter than usual. The crackle of the flames as the fire consumed the timber crumbling into ash, the smell of the thick smoke as it blew into my face, the laughing crowds, the couples hand in hand jumping over the flames in the flickering shadows of the midsummer night. Some of the girls squealed and shrieked as the flames licked at their clothes or their bare feet, but they were not really afraid. I knew that it was just for the benefit of the boys, who were watching them with a new interest. My father had picked out a boy for me. His name was Rory, and we had known each other since childhood. We had played together as children, but in recent years he had grown more distant as he began to spend his time with the other older boys and the men. I wondered if he had already become a man. That summer he had begun to pay attention to me and had started to find reasons to call to our wrath several times a week. My father had decided that he would make a good husband and had said that he could marry me after St. John's Day. It was said to be a lucky time to get married. Silently, I took his outstretched hand and jumped through the flames. It was done. Soon we would be wed. But I hugged my secret to myself and smiled a secret smile. Summer faded into autumn. The crops ripened and would soon need to be harvested. The trees drooped heavy with fruit. It had been a good year, and soon the preparations would begin again for Samhain, the feast of plenty before the long, hungry days of winter began once more. I still worked in the fields, though I found it harder as the days went by as my belly swelled. The older women congratulated me and started to give me advice on what to do before and after. Some offered prayers, but others whispered ancient charms and spells, which I knew the priests had outlawed. My mother was silent. I think she knew what had happened and feared what was to come. My father looked serious. My brothers said nothing. Michaelmas came and went, and it was on a sunny Sunday, just after that a dusty, ragged stranger appeared in our village. He said that he had walked for many days, and he brought news of a terrible battle at the great moat in the south, where the army of the Gael had been defeated. My father banished us all from the hearth room, but my mother and I listened outside the door as the traveller told his tale. He spoke of the hundreds who had been killed and how the fields around the moat were now full of rotting bodies on whom the wolves and the ravens fed. Many had not even received a Christian burial. Their leader had been hacked down fighting bravely against scores of the enemy. The stranger had managed to rescue the leader's golden brooch before fleeing and had brought it with him from the battlefield. I glanced at my mother, then silently we moved away from the door. Outside, the sun still shone and the birds were singing. The wheat waved back and forth in the soft wind. I opened my mouth, as if to howl like those wolves in the night time. I felt the child kick in my belly and I knew that I should not mourn. And when the last red leaves of the great oaks floated down to join their fallen companions on the rich soil, my little boy was born. His hair was bright red, and I knew that he would be a great warrior and would, one day, do great and famous things.